The morning sun glinted off the pristine waters of Lake Willow, casting a golden sheen that belied the brewing storm of suburban conflict. Mark Taggart stood on the weathered dock, his calloused hands gripping a steaming mug of coffee, watching as his sleek BMW with a vanity plate, HOA, only rolled to a stop behind his rusted pickup truck. He didn't need to turn around to know who was approaching. The crisp footsteps, the rustle of pressed cactus, the barely contained anger. These were the hallmarks of Gerald Whitmore, the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association president, who had made it his personal mission to make Mark's life miserable. "Mr. Taggart," Gerald's voice cut through the morning stillness like a knife, "we've received multiple complaints about your vessel. It's a clear violation of Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws." Mark took a deliberate sip of his coffee, savoring the moment before turning to face his nemesis. At 52, he carried the weathered look of a man who had seen more than his share of battles, both on and off the water. His salt and pepper beard and deep-set eyes told a story of decades spent navigating life's choppy waters. The boat in question was no ordinary vessel. A 38-foot Chris Craft Commander, meticulously restored over 15 painstaking years, sat moored exactly where Mark's grandfather had first anchored it decades ago. This wasn't just a boat, it was a legacy, a living piece of family history that ran deeper than any HOA could comprehend. Gerald thrust a manila envelope forward, his perfectly manicured hand trembling with righteous indignation. "You have exactly 7 days to remove this maritime eyesore from our community waters." A lesser man might have wilted under the assault, but Mark Taggart was not a lesser man. His lips curled into a knowing smile, the kind that suggested he knew something Gerald did not. And indeed he did. What Gerald and the rest of the Lakeview Estates HOA didn't realize was that Mark's connection to this lake ran far deeper than their pristine, manicured subdivision. His family's history with Lake Willow predated their fancy gated community by nearly a century. In fact, the very water they claimed to control bore the Taggart name in ways they could never imagine. "Is that so, Gerald?" Mark's voice was calm, almost amused. He set down his coffee mug on an old wooden crate, never breaking eye contact with the HOA president. "I'd be careful about the threats you're making." Gerald shuffled uncomfortably, sensing something was off but unable to pinpoint exactly what. The morning breeze rippled across the lake's surface, carrying with it the promise of a confrontation years in the making. Mark's mind drifted back to the stories his grandfather had told him, tales of how the Taggart family had been the original caretakers of Lake Willow, how they had preserved its ecosystem, fought for its protection long before developers like Gerald had even heard of the place. Those stories were more than just memories. They were about to become a powerful weapon. 7 days, Gerald repeated, though his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. 7 days to move that boat. Mark simply smiled. The real story was just beginning. The next morning, Mark pulled out an old leather-bound portfolio that had belonged to his grandfather, William Taggart. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through his study window as he carefully unfolded documents that told a story most residents of Lakeview Estates had never heard. The first document was a warranty deed from 1932, a land transfer that revealed something extraordinary. Tucked between yellowed pages was a unique clause that would make Gerald Whitmore's perfectly coiffed hair stand on end. The original land grant included not just the shoreline property, but a significant portion of the lake itself. Mark's grandmother, Elena, had been a formidable legal mind. A lawyer before it was common for women to practice law, she had negotiated this land transfer with a precision that would make modern real estate attorneys weep. The document was a masterpiece of legal language, essentially granting the Taggart family perpetual riparian rights that extended far beyond what a typical waterfront property owner would possess. He remembered the stories she told him during long summer evenings on this very lake, how her father, Mark's great-grandfather, had been instrumental in the lake's initial conservation efforts, how the Taggart family had essentially been the lake's first stewards, protecting its ecosystem long before environmental protection became a buzzword. A phone call interrupted his research. It was his sister, Rebecca, a local historian with a nose for family lore. "I heard about Gerald's little ultimatum," she said, a hint of mischief in her voice. "Have you shown them the documents?" Mark chuckled. "Not yet. Sometimes it's better to let your opponent dig their own hole." Rebecca knew exactly what he meant. The Taggart family had a long-standing reputation for strategic patience. They weren't interested in immediate confrontation, but in a measured response that would leave no room for argument. As he continued sorting through the documents, Mark discovered something even more intriguing. A series of correspondence between his grandfather and the state's Water Management Board revealed a complex agreement that predated the Lakeview Estates development by decades. It suggested that any significant changes to the lake's usage would require not just HOA approval, but direct consent from the Taggart family. The irony wasn't lost on Mark. Gerald and his HOA board believed they controlled the lake, but they were about to learn a painful lesson in property rights and local history. He pulled out his phone and took high-resolution scans of each document. The digital age had its advantages, and Mark intended to use every tool at his disposal. These weren't just old papers. They were ammunition. A notification popped up on his screen. Another email from the HOA, this time with a more formal letterhead. Mark smiled. They had no idea what was coming. The boat wasn't just a vessel. It was a symbol, a connection to a legacy that ran deeper than any HOA could comprehend. And Mark Taggart was about to prove exactly how deep those roots went. The Lakeview Estates Community Center buzzed with nervous energy that Tuesday evening. Mark arrived precisely at 7 p.m., a meticulously organized folder tucked under his arm, his restored vintage boat model, a miniature replica of his actual vessel, carried carefully in his other hand. The monthly HOA meeting was usually a predictable affair. Complaints about lawn heights, debates about trash can placement, and Gerald Whitmore's self-important monologues. But tonight would be different. As Mark entered the room, heads turned. He was something of an outsider in this community, a local who predated most of the current residents, someone who didn't quite fit their manicured narrative. Some neighbors whispered, others stared outright. Gerald's face tightened the moment Mark walked in. "We have a special item on tonight's agenda," Gerald announced, his voice dripping with manufactured authority. The unauthorized boat moored at the north end of Lake Willow. Mark sat quietly, his weathered hands resting on the boat model. It was a conversation piece, a miniature version of the very vessel causing such controversy, meticulously crafted by his grandfather. Each tiny detail told a story of maritime craftsmanship that these HOA members could never understand. Rebecca had advised him to let Gerald speak first. "Give him enough rope," she said with a knowing smile. Gerald launched into a lengthy discourse. He cited bylaws, referenced community standards, and painted Mark as a disruptive element. "Mr. Taggart's boat is an eyesore that reduces property values," he proclaimed, looking around the room for support. "It does not conform to our community's aesthetic standards." The room murmured in agreement, a chorus of suburban conformity that made Mark's lips curl slightly. When Gerald finally paused for breath, Mark stood up. The room fell silent. "Before we discuss my boat," he began, "I'd like to share a piece of local history most of you don't know." He placed the miniature boat model on the podium, a tangible link to the lake's past. Then, with methodical precision, he began to unfold the documents he discovered: original land grants, water rights agreements, conservation records that painted a dramatically different picture of Lake Willow's history. "This lake," Mark said, his voice steady and clear, "has been in my family's care long before any of you owned property here. These documents prove not just our ownership rights, but our commitment to preserving this ecosystem." Gasps rippled through the room. Gerald's confident demeanor began to crack. Mark wasn't just defending his boat. He was revealing a hidden history, a narrative of conservation, family legacy, and land stewardship that challenged everything the HOA thought they knew about Lake Willow. The miniature boat model stood as a silent witness, a symbol of generations of maritime tradition. And Mark was just getting started. The real battle was about to begin. The aftermath of the HOA meeting was like a slow-burning fuse. Mark knew Gerald wouldn't take defeat quietly. True to form, a certified letter arrived exactly 3 days later, a document so densely worded it could have doubled as a legal weapon. The county courthouse became Mark's second home. His sister Rebecca, now fully invested in the family's fight, spent hours researching archival records. They discovered something even more remarkable: a series of conservation easements and water management agreements that the Taggart family had negotiated decades ago. "Look at this," Rebecca said one evening, spreading out a massive map on Mark's kitchen table. Her finger traced a complex boundary line that seemed to dance around the lake's perimeter. "These agreements aren't just about property rights. They're about environmental protection." The map told a story of generations. It showed how the Taggart family had worked with local environmental agencies, creating a unique legal framework that protected the lake's ecosystem. Each line was a testament to their commitment, a commitment that predated the HOA by decades. Gerald, meanwhile, was mounting his own offensive. He'd hired a local law firm known for its aggressive approach to property disputes. Mark knew this wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about control, about the narrative of who truly owned and understood Lake Willow. Rumors began to circulate through Lakeview Estates. Some residents started taking sides. The local coffee shop became a battleground of whispered conversations and pointed glances. Mark became both a local legend and a pariah, the man who dared to challenge the HOA's authority. But Mark had an ace up his sleeve. His grandmother Alina's meticulous record-keeping had preserved something extraordinary: a series of correspondence with state environmental officials that outlined the Taggart family's unique relationship with the lake. One particular letter, dated from 1965, stood out. It was from the state's water management director acknowledging the Taggart family's extraordinary role in preserving Lake Willow's ecosystem. The language was formal, but the underlying message was clear. The Taggart family wasn't just a landowner. They were the lake's guardians. Rebecca discovered something else. A geological survey that suggested the lake's original boundaries were far different from what the HOA claimed. They've been operating under a complete misunderstanding, she told Mark, her historian's excitement barely contained. Mark's boat, the restored Chris Craft Commander, became more than just a vessel. It was a symbol of resistance, a floating monument to family history. Each time Gerald or his HOA cronies looked out over the lake, the boat was there, a constant reminder of their limited understanding. The legal battle was brewing. Mark knew it would be complex, potentially dragging on for months or even years. But he was prepared. The Taggart family had never backed down from a fight, especially when it came to protecting what was rightfully theirs. As the sun set over Lake Willow, casting long shadows across the water, Mark stood on his dock. The boat rocked gently against its moorings, a silent sentinel waiting for the next move in this suburban war of wills. The courtroom was a study in contrasts. On one side sat Gerald Whitmore, flanked by two expensive lawyers in tailored suits. On the other, Mark Taggart stood with his sister Rebecca, armed with generations of documented history and an unwavering resolve. Judge Margaret Harriman was no stranger to property disputes, but this case was unlike anything she'd seen in her 27 years on the bench. The case file was a massive tome, filled with historical documents, geological surveys, and legal agreements that spanned nearly a century. Mr. Taggart, the judge began, her reading glasses perched precariously on the edge of her nose, you're claiming not just riparian rights, but essentially partial ownership of the lake itself. Mark's response was measured. Your Honor, what I'm claiming is the legal recognition of my family's historical role as stewards of Lake Willow. These documents prove we've been managing and protecting this ecosystem long before Lakeview Estates was even a concept. Rebecca had meticulously organized their evidence. Photographs from the 1930s showed Mark's great-grandfather working with state conservation officers. Geological surveys revealed the original lake boundaries. Most damning were the conservation easements, legal documents that demonstrated the Taggart family's unique relationship with the water. Gerald's lawyers attempted to argue that these historical documents were irrelevant. The HOA represents the current property owners, their lead attorney proclaimed. Historical claims cannot supersede current community standards. But Mark had prepared for this argument. He presented a series of environmental impact studies, some commissioned by the Taggart family decades ago, that showed how their stewardship had preserved the lake's ecosystem. Water quality reports, wildlife preservation records, erosion prevention strategies all traced back to the Taggart family's efforts. The courtroom was silent as Mark recounted a story that was part family history, part environmental testament. He spoke of summers spent cleaning the lake, of generations who had monitored its health, of a commitment that went far beyond property lines. Judge Harriman's interest was visibly piqued. During a recess, she requested additional documentation, asking detailed questions about the historical agreements and conservation efforts. Gerald's confidence began to crack. What had started as a simple HOA complaint was transforming into a complex legal battle about environmental stewardship, property rights, and local history. Outside the courthouse, local media had caught wind of the story. Local family challenges HOA. Claims ownership of entire lake, read one headline. Social media was ablaze with speculation and support. Mark knew this was about more than just his boat. It was about preserving a legacy, protecting an ecosystem that his family had cared for generations before the first HOA home was built. As the day's proceedings concluded, Rebecca leaned close to her brother. We've got them on the ropes, she whispered, a gleam of triumph in her eyes. The final day of the hearing was approaching. The lake itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a resolution that would change everything.